This is the story of Esosa, a young man from Benin who grew up in Lagos and later gained admission into the University of Benin, Uniben. Drawn to the search for respect, belonging, and power, Esosa joined the Vikings Confraternity and quickly rose through the ranks as a feared hitman. His life became defined by violence, loyalty, and rivalry, particularly with the Airlord Confraternity. Though he gained the recognition he always desired, his choices ultimately led to betrayal and his execution at the hands of his enemies. Esosa's story begins long before the University of Benin became the stage for his rise and fall. To understand the boy who would later be feared on campus, one must return to his roots, his childhood between Benin City and Lagos, and the forces that shaped his hunger for respect. Esosa was born in Benin City, a place that carried centuries of history, traditions, and a deep sense of identity. His parents, like many families in Benin, valued discipline, education, and the preservation of culture. Yet while his roots were firmly tied to Benin, his early years unfolded in Lagos. The family had moved there in search of opportunity, joining countless others who flooded Nigeria's largest city with hopes of building a better life. Growing up in Lagos was a lesson in survival. The city was a restless giant, its streets always alive, its people always in motion. Noise filled the air, the honking of buses, the calls of traders, the hum of conversations in markets that never seemed to sleep. In that chaos, respect was not something handed out, it was something demanded, sometimes by voice, sometimes by strength. Esosa was a quiet child at first, observant rather than outspoken. But even in his silence, he noticed the patterns around him. He saw how certain young men in his neighborhood carried themselves with a confidence that silenced mockery before it could begin. They walked with authority, their shoulders squared, their presence undeniable. People moved for them, respected them, and sometimes even feared them. To young Esosa, this was power. In school, he was an average student, not poor in performance, but not the shining star either. His teachers often described him as intelligent but easily distracted. What truly drew his attention was not the books in front of him but the world outside. He admired those who commanded recognition in the streets. While his parents dreamed of him becoming a professional, perhaps a lawyer, engineer, or doctor, Esosa quietly nurtured a different dream. He wanted to be seen, respected, and never ignored. His parents, however, carried a strong sense of responsibility for his future. His father often reminded him that discipline was the bridge between dreams and achievement. His mother, equally firm, believed that education was the path that separated success from failure. Both of them carried the hope that their son would embody dignity, not the restless defiance that city life often inspired in young men. Though they had built a life in Lagos, the family never let go of their connection to Benin. They returned often, sometimes for holidays, sometimes for family obligations. Each trip reminded Esosa of where he came from. He admired the pride with which the elders of Benin spoke about their traditions and history. Yet for him, Benin was a place of roots, not yet a place of destiny. Lagos remained his training ground, the city that taught him about survival, recognition, and the thin line between respect and fear. By the time Esosa approached the end of secondary school, his hunger for recognition had only deepened. He no longer wanted to blend into the background of Lagos life. He had tasted enough of invisibility, enough of being ordinary. He wanted more. Respect, in his mind, was not only a want, it was a need. When the time came for him to pursue higher education, his parents made a decision that changed the trajectory of his life. They insisted he return to Benin for university. To them, it was not just about academics. It was about grounding their son in the values of home. Lagos had given him exposure, but Benin, they believed, would give him roots and discipline. Their choice was the University of Benin, Uniben. A prestigious institution, it was known not only for its academics but also for its sprawling campus life. Students from across Nigeria converged there, bringing with them different cultures, ambitions, and, sometimes, rivalries. When Esosa received his admission letter, his parents rejoiced. They saw it as the beginning of a bright future, the opening chapter of success. For Esosa, however, the admission represented something more complex. It was not only a chance at education but a chance at transformation. A university was not just a place for books. It was a stage where identities were shaped, tested, and defined. Deep inside, he already carried the dream of becoming more than ordinary. He had seen how respect operated in Lagos, how fear could protect as much as admiration. Now, stepping into Uniben, he saw the opportunity to carve a name for himself, not only as a student but as someone who would be respected, seen, and never forgotten. His parents celebrated his journey with pride, but Esosa's heart was already searching for something beyond academics. He was about to enter a world where belonging was power, and where the lines between fear, respect, and survival blurred into one. When Esosa arrived at the University of Benin, it was like stepping into a world entirely different from the Lagos streets he knew. The sprawling campus stretched wide, with lecture halls, hostels, walkways, and open spaces that seemed alive with the rhythm of thousands of students. To a newcomer, the environment was both exciting and intimidating. Esosa carried the pride of his admission letter and the expectations of his family, but the campus quickly revealed that academics alone did not define a student's life at Uniben. There was a hierarchy invisible to outsiders, yet deeply understood by every student who had spent even a few weeks on campus. Respect was not distributed equally. Almost immediately, Esosa noticed how certain students moved with authority. They walked in groups, their confidence sharp, their presence commanding attention. Others moved in silence, always cautious, blending into the background to avoid confrontation. Conversations in hostels and lecture halls were filled with warnings about who not to cross, which areas to avoid, and how the balance of power worked among students. Esosa quickly learned that, in Uniben, belonging mattered. To be isolated was to be vulnerable. Stories were whispered of students who had been harassed, robbed, or beaten simply because they had no protection. It wasn't always random. Sometimes it was a reminder of how unforgiving campus life could be to those without backing. Among the various student groups, confraternities stood at the center of this power structure. Their presence was visible even though they operated in secrecy. Each confraternity carried its own identity, its own reputation, and its own network. Some were known for their flamboyance, others for their ruthlessness, and some for their deep sense of loyalty among members. To Esosa, who had always admired strength and recognition, these groups represented everything he had long desired. His heart, however, was drawn to one in particular: the Vikings. The Vikings Confraternity was not new to Uniben. They had been on campus for years, building a reputation that spread far beyond the university's walls. Their members were bold, respected, and feared in equal measure. Their symbols carried weight, and their presence was undeniable. Students moved aside for them, whether out of admiration or out of fear. Esosa observed closely in those early days. He noticed how members of the Vikings never seemed to be harassed or belittled. They commanded respect simply by being who they were. For a guy who had grown up with a hunger to be seen, this was the life he had dreamed about quietly, long before he ever set foot on campus. Yet with this attraction came awareness. He learned through whispers that joining a confraternity was not without its dangers. Rivalries were fierce, and violence was never far away. The Airlords, in particular, had a long-standing conflict with the Vikings. Their clashes were legendary on campus, remembered for the lives they had claimed and the fear they left behind. Still, Esosa felt the pull more strongly each day. Every time he saw a Viking move across campus with that unmistakable confidence, his desire deepened. The respect, the fear, the belonging, it was everything he had always wanted. For now, though, he remained an outsider. A freshman navigating the university system, learning how to adapt to lectures, to hostel life, and to the new rhythm of adulthood. But beneath it all, His mind was not only on academics. It was on the path that would give him the recognition he had long dreamed of. He had taken his first steps into Uniben, but already his destiny was being shaped. He was no longer just a student. He was a young man searching for power, for respect, and for belonging. And in Uniben, that path led directly into the arms of a confraternity. The University of Benin was not just an institution of learning. It was a stage where identities were constantly being tested and reshaped. For a young man like Esosa, newly admitted and eager to define himself, the atmosphere of campus life was intoxicating. Each day revealed new layers of how power operated within the university. While lectures carried on as expected, professors teaching, students scribbling notes, the true dynamics of campus respect played out outside the classrooms. In the hostels, on the walkways, and in the open spaces where students gathered, Isosa witnessed a hierarchy built not on grades or intelligence but on presence, strength, and affiliation. Among all the confraternities on campus, it was the Vikings that caught his eye most sharply. They carried a reputation that seemed larger than life. Their very name was spoken with caution, a mixture of respect and fear. To ordinary students, they were untouchable. To rivals, they were enemies to be confronted with equal force. The Vikings moved as a unit. Even in casual moments, their solidarity was visible. They walked together, often in small groups, their confidence unmistakable. Students made way for them in hallways without being asked. Hostel corridors grew silent when they passed. There was an aura that set them apart from the rest of the campus. For Esosa, who had grown up in Lagos admiring strength and respect, this was the very embodiment of what he wanted to become. The way they commanded space without saying a word resonated with a hunger he had carried since boyhood. He had always hated invisibility, and here, right in front of him, was proof that invisibility could be defeated. But attraction was only the beginning. The decision to approach such a group was one that required courage, and more importantly, commitment. Esosa listened closely to the stories whispered by other students. Stories of initiation, of secrecy, of loyalty, and of violence. He learned that once you stepped into a confraternity, you did not step back out. It was a permanent bond, sealed not only by rituals but by blood, loyalty, and shared risks. The Vikings' history fascinated him as well. They were known for their symbolism, their fiery identity, and their commitment to brotherhood. Their songs, colors, and emblems carried meaning that went beyond ordinary student life. It was a fraternity built on courage, loyalty, and the promise of protection. Esosa's desire to belong grew steadily. Each time he saw members move across campus, each time he heard the stories of their strength, his admiration deepened. But he also knew the risks. By joining them, he would inherit their enemies. The Airlords, in particular, were spoken of often. Their rivalry with the Vikings was one of the most entrenched conflicts on campus, dating back years and marked by violent clashes. To choose the Vikings was to choose conflict with the Airlords automatically. And yet, for Esosa, the benefits outweighed the dangers. The alternative, remaining ordinary, vulnerable, and unseen, was far less appealing. He had not only come to Uniben simply to collect a degree, he had also come searching for recognition, for respect, for the transformation that had lived in his dreams for years. The Vikings' lifestyle promised him all of that. It promised protection from harassment, it promised respect that came with fear, and it promised brotherhood, a network of men who would stand by him in times of danger. The decision was not yet public, but in his heart, Esosa had already chosen. He would not remain an ordinary student. He would not walk alone, blending into the shadows of campus life. He would join the Vikings Confraternity. And when he did, he would never again be invisible. Every confraternity on Nigerian campuses had its own rites of passage, a process that marked the transition from the ordinary to the extraordinary. For Esosa, the decision to join the Vikings meant stepping into a world where secrecy, loyalty, and endurance were not just expected but demanded. The initiation was never spoken of openly. Those who had passed through it carried their memories in silence, bound by the code of secrecy that governed every aspect of confraternity life. Outsiders speculated about what happened. Some spoke of brutal beatings, others of strange rituals, and still others of symbolic acts that bonded recruits forever. The truth was that each confraternity had its own unique style, and the Vikings were no exception. When the time came, Esosa was quietly guided into the process. His approach to the Vikings had not gone unnoticed. They had seen his admiration, his attempts to linger near them, and his hunger for recognition. The fraternity valued confidence and resilience, and Esosa had shown both. The initiation began at night, far from the eyes of ordinary students. It was always conducted in hidden spaces, abandoned classrooms, bush paths, or secluded corners of the hostels. The first stage was psychological. Recruits were stripped of comfort and forced to confront fear. For Esosa, it was the sudden realization that he was no longer in control of his environment. His trust now lay entirely in the hands of the Vikings. The second stage tested the body. Initiation into the Vikings was known for its emphasis on endurance. Pain was introduced as a teacher, not an enemy. Recruits were made to endure physical hardship, running, kneeling for hours, exhaustion, and trials that pushed their limits. Each moment was designed to break down the individual's old self, stripping away weakness and self-doubt. Only then could the new identity be built. Esosa struggled but refused to give in. His desire to belong outweighed the pain. His vision of respect outweighed the humiliation. He reminded himself that generations of Vikings before him had walked the same path. What he endured was not punishment, it was transformation. Then came the symbolic acts. For the Vikings, identity was built around brotherhood, fire, and loyalty. Each recruit was given marks of belonging, tokens and symbols that connected him to the fraternity's heritage. For Esosa, this was the moment when the invisible wall between him and the Vikings broke. He was no longer on the outside looking in. He was inside, bound by oath and ritual. Finally, the last stage was the vow. Every confraternity required loyalty, and for the Vikings, that loyalty was sacred. The recruit pledged himself to the Brotherhood, not in casual words but in binding commitment. It was an oath that declared he would never betray the fraternity, never abandon a brother, and never reveal its secrets. When the initiation ended, Isosa was no longer the same. The boy who had walked into that night was gone. In his place stood a young man reborn into the Vikings' Brotherhood. The bruises on his body were badges of honor. The exhaustion in his muscles was proof of his endurance. And the fire in his spirit was brighter than ever before. The next morning, as he moved across campus, nothing outwardly marked him as different. To ordinary students, he was still Esosa, a young man attending lectures, eating in the cafeteria, and blending into the crowd. But within the hidden hierarchy of Uniben, his status had changed forever. He now carried a new identity, one that commanded respect and demanded responsibility. He was a Viking. The initiation was behind him, but its echoes still lingered in Esosa's body and spirit. For days afterward, he carried the marks of what he had endured, bruises that ached, muscles that burned, and a fatigue that clung to him. Yet none of that mattered. What mattered was that he had crossed the threshold. He was no longer a spectator in the hidden theater of campus confraternity life. He was now a player, a brother among the Vikings. The first taste of power came subtly. It wasn't a sudden shift, but a gradual realization that people looked at him differently. In the dining hall, students who once brushed past him without notice now offered space. At night, as he walked through the dimly lit corridors of the hostels, eyes followed him with a mixture of caution and curiosity. It was the beginning of respect, earned not through academic achievement or social charm, but through the silent badge of fear that confraternity membership carried. Protection came next. Campus life in Uniben, like many universities across Nigeria, was a complicated ecosystem. Petty theft was common, intimidation was frequent, and those without connections often became victims. Esosa had once been on the edge of that vulnerability, unsure of how to navigate the unspoken rules. But now, things were different. Where others worried about being cornered or harassed, Esosa walked with confidence. The knowledge that he was backed by a brotherhood gave him a new kind of freedom. He no longer feared losing his belongings to opportunistic hands or being intimidated by stronger students. The Vikings provided a shield, and that shield extended to every aspect of his daily life. Respect among confraternity members was another revelation. The Vikings valued hierarchy and brotherhood in equal measure. Though Esosa was new, he was treated as part of something larger than himself. Older members acknowledged him with nods, a gesture that might have seemed small but carried immense weight. It meant he was recognized, accepted, and counted among them. Soon, the fraternity began to shape his routine. Ordinary students measured their time by lectures, assignments, and exams. For Esosa, life now included another dimension: meetings, gatherings, and obligations to the Brotherhood. The call of the Vikings could come at any hour, and attendance was not optional. Whether it was a late-night gathering in a hidden corner of campus or a daytime show of solidarity, Esosa was expected to be present, committed, and loyal. This dual life, student by day, Viking by night, transformed him. The university had once seemed like a confusing maze, filled with unspoken rules that he struggled to understand. Now, those rules were clear. The Vikings gave him structure, identity, and purpose. He wasn't just a student trying to find his place. He was a Viking, and that commanded its own kind of order. Fear also became a companion, not his own, but that of others. Students who had once dismissed him now avoided confrontation. Rivals from other confraternities regarded him with suspicion and caution. Even lecturers, aware of the reach of campus fraternities, sometimes hesitated to challenge members too directly. Esosa had stepped into a space where ordinary limits no longer applied. Yet with power came responsibility. The Vikings were not a club one joined for leisure. Membership came with duties, and those duties sometimes stretched into dangerous territory. Though Esosa was still new, he could see the outline of what was expected of him. The Brotherhood protected its own, but in return, it demanded loyalty, presence, and action. For now, his role was to learn, to observe, and to absorb the ways of the fraternity. But already, he felt the pull of a deeper commitment. He had always longed for respect, and now he had it. He had always admired the confraternity lifestyle, and now he was living it. Each day reinforced the reality that he was no longer invisible. He was seen, acknowledged, and feared. The transformation was complete in his own eyes. Esosa had not just joined the Vikings, he had become part of their legacy. The boy who had arrived at Uniben unsure of how to be respected was gone. In his place stood a young man who carried the weight of a brotherhood on his shoulders, and with it, the intoxicating taste of power. Every confraternity on Nigerian campuses had its circle of rivals, but none carried a rivalry as deep-rooted and dangerous as that between the Vikings and the Airlords. It was a conflict older than Esosa's admission into the university, stretching back through generations of confrontations, retaliations, and bloodshed. When Esosa pledged loyalty to the Vikings, he automatically stepped into that battle line. He did not choose the Airlords as enemies. Membership had chosen them for him. The history of the feud was woven into the very culture of Uniben. Both confraternities commanded loyalty, both sought dominance, and both refused to yield. Decades of clashes had turned their rivalry into something more than a struggle for influence. It was a matter of identity, pride, and survival. Each side saw the other as an existential threat, and peace was never more than a temporary illusion. Esosa began to see the effects of this rivalry almost immediately after his initiation. Whispers reached him about fights that had erupted in previous semesters, about ambushes in dark alleys, and about names of students who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. These stories were not told as legends but as warnings, reminders that to wear the colors of the Vikings was to live with a target on your back. The first time he encountered the Airlords up close, he understood this reality in a visceral way. It wasn't in the middle of a fight or a coordinated clash, but in the charged silence of an accidental meeting. He was walking with fellow Vikings across campus when a group of Airlords appeared from the opposite direction. There were no words, no open threats, but the air thickened with hostility. Every glance carried meaning. Every step was measured. For Esosa, it was a moment of awakening. He was not merely a student anymore. He was a marked man in the eyes of an opposing force. From that day forward, vigilance became part of his life. He could no longer move carelessly across campus, nor could he trust the neutrality of ordinary spaces. The cafeteria, the lecture halls, even the library could become arenas of confrontation if rival members crossed paths. Survival required awareness, loyalty to his brothers, and a readiness to defend himself at all times. The Vikings did not allow their new members to drift into complacency. Isosa was reminded again and again that loyalty was not passive. To be a Viking was to be an active participant in the fraternity's defense and expansion. That meant being prepared for conflict with the Airlords whenever it arose. The older members spoke not with words of reassurance but through their actions, always moving in groups, always watching their surroundings, always ready for sudden escalation. Esosa learned quickly that the rivalry extended beyond personal grudges. It was systemic. The Vikings and the Airlords competed for influence not just on campus but in the surrounding city. They sought dominance in nightlife, in student politics, and in the informal economies that thrived around the university. Every small victory, an election won, an area controlled, a show of strength displayed, added fuel to the fire of their enmity. As he became more integrated into the Brotherhood, Esosa began to hear his own name spoken alongside warnings. The Airlords had noticed him, not because of anything he had done yet, but because he was now one of them. His identity as a Viking overshadowed his individuality. In the eyes of their rivals, he was not Esosa the student from Lagos. He was Esosa the Viking, and that alone made him a target. This inheritance of enemies was both empowering and terrifying. On one hand, it reinforced the sense of belonging he craved. He was part of something larger than himself, a brotherhood united not just in loyalty but in shared opposition. On the other hand, it meant his life carried risks he had never faced before. Any careless step, any moment of weakness, could draw the attention of rivals who would show no mercy. Esosa embraced the reality with the same determination that had carried him through initiation. If respect came at this cost, then it was a price he was willing to pay. He had chosen this path, and the path demanded vigilance, courage, and commitment. To be a Viking was to walk in both light and shadow, celebrated by brothers and hunted by rivals. The rivalry with the Airlords was no longer just history to him, it was his present, and soon it would shape his future. Esosa's early months in the Vikings Brotherhood had been about learning, blending, and proving loyalty. But confraternities, especially one as combative as the Vikings, did not allow members to remain passive for long. Every brother was expected to contribute, and contributions were often measured in action. The rivalry with the Airlords was not an abstract idea. It was lived every day in Uniben's hostels, lecture halls, and hidden corners. For Esosa, the shift from being a new initiate to becoming a recognized soldier began with small roles. At first, he was called upon to provide presence, showing up at gatherings to swell the numbers, walking in groups through the campus to send a message of dominance, or standing firm in tense situations where silence itself was a weapon. But presence was only the beginning. The Vikings valued those who could act, those who could move from symbolic shows of strength to direct confrontation when the Brotherhood's security was at stake. Esosa's physical build, his boldness, and his hunger for respect made him a natural candidate for these roles. The first tasks were simple but carried immense weight. Escorting senior members at night, shadowing rival movements, keeping watch at gatherings, each was a test of discipline and courage. In these moments, Isosa learned that fear could not be shown. The rival confraternities thrived on intimidation, and survival meant meeting hostility with an unflinching gaze. Soon, Isosa began to stand out. Older members noticed his willingness to step forward, his refusal to shrink when tensions rose. It was this quality that propelled him into more serious responsibilities. The Vikings were locked in constant skirmishes with the Airlords, and these skirmishes required men who could strike without hesitation. Esosa was becoming one of them. The transformation from ordinary member to hitman was gradual, marked by escalating encounters. Ambushes in dark alleys, sudden fights during campus events, and retaliatory strikes for perceived offenses all became part of his reality. Each clash was a test, and each survival added to his reputation. With time, his name began to circulate beyond his immediate circle. Among the Vikings, he was seen as reliable muscle, someone who could be called upon when action was needed. Among rivals, his name became a warning, a reminder that crossing paths with him meant danger. This rise did not happen without consequence. Fear and respect often came at the cost of humanity. Esosa found himself hardened, his sense of normal student life slipping further away. Lectures and assignments became secondary, almost irrelevant. The real education he was undergoing was in survival, loyalty, and power. His world was now defined by codes of silence, bonds of brotherhood, and the ever-present possibility of violence. By the time Esosa was fully recognized as one of the Vikings' hitmen, his life had taken on a new rhythm. He was no longer just protected. He was now the protector, the enforcer, the one others looked to in moments of conflict. His actions reinforced the Vikings' reputation on campus, strengthening their dominance and striking fear into the hearts of their enemies. But with this role came a darker inheritance. Being a hitman meant carrying a constant burden of risk. He was not just another face in the crowd anymore, he was marked. The Airlords knew his name, knew his face, and saw him as a priority target. Every move he made, every step across campus, was shadowed by the knowledge that rivals were watching, waiting for an opportunity. Esosa had wanted respect, and he had found it. He had wanted to be feared, and that too had become his reality. But with each victory came a question that lingered in the silence after the clashes. How long could this life be sustained? On a campus where every feud demanded retaliation and every show of strength invited an answer, the life of a hitman was as celebrated as it was precarious. Esosa had risen quickly, faster than most. But the higher he climbed in reputation, the more dangerous his fall would be. By the time Esosa had established himself as one of the Vikings' enforcers, his presence alone carried meaning. He no longer needed to speak or act for people to understand who he was. His reputation preceded him, and in the delicate ecosystem of Uniben, reputation was everything. Ordinary students, who once walked past him without a glance, now avoided his gaze. Conversations would quiet when he entered a room. In lecture halls, a seat near him was often left empty, not because people disliked him personally, but because proximity carried risk. To be close to a confraternity member, especially one known for violence, was to invite unwanted attention from rivals. For many, the safest choice was distance. Respect came in subtle gestures. Junior students made way for him in crowded corridors. Vendors at kiosks served him quickly, rarely questioning his requests. Even taxi drivers within the university environment seemed to know when to remain silent and when to extend courtesy. These gestures were not rooted in admiration but in calculation. Everyone knew that offending a Viking, particularly one with Esosa's reputation, could carry consequences far beyond the moment. Lecturers, too, were not immune to the influence. On the surface, the classroom was a space of order, governed by rules and academic authority. Yet, beneath that surface, the silent power of confraternities lingered. Some lecturers maintained a firm stance, refusing to acknowledge the presence of cultism. But others tread carefully, aware that harsh treatment of a known confraternity member could spark retaliation outside the classroom. Esosa understood this dynamic. He wasn't above academic struggles, but he was shielded from the kind of harassment or belittlement that ordinary students sometimes faced. Fear worked in his favor even where respect did not. Still, power came with its own isolation. Isosa noticed that friendships from his early days on campus had thinned. People who once shared casual conversations with him now kept their distance, wary of being associated with him too closely. In the eyes of many, he was no longer Esosa the student. He was Esosa the Viking, a title that overshadowed everything else. This duality weighed heavily on him. On one hand, he reveled in the status he had earned. The respect he had craved since his days in Lagos was now his reality. No one mocked him, no one disregarded him, and no one dared to treat him as invisible. On the other hand, the cost of that respect was a kind of loneliness. Genuine connection was scarce. Every interaction was filtered through caution, fear, or calculation. Within the Vikings, however, Esosa found belonging. The Brotherhood was his family on campus, the one place where his identity was celebrated rather than feared. Among them, his reputation elevated his standing. He was trusted for assignments, respected for his courage, and seen as a brother who embodied the fraternity's ideals of strength and loyalty. Yet even within this circle, the constant shadow of conflict loomed. Each gathering was filled with an unspoken awareness that rivals could strike at any time. The psychological toll of living under constant threat became clearer as months passed. Nights were restless, often interrupted by sudden calls to action. Days were spent balancing academics with the demands of fraternity life. The line between student and warrior blurred until they were nearly indistinguishable. For Esosa, the university was no longer a place of learning. It was a battleground disguised as an institution. Still, he pressed on. The respect he had earned was intoxicating, and the fear he commanded gave him a sense of invincibility. But deep within, he also understood the fragility of it all. In a world where violence dictated respect, survival was the only true measure of success. One wrong step, one unlucky encounter, could strip away everything he had built. Esosa lived under the weight of fear and respect, carrying both as if they were inseparable companions. Fear from others gave him respect, and respect fed his desire to remain feared. It was a cycle that propelled him forward, even as it tightened around him like an invisible chain. 4 months, Esosa had walked the campus of Uniben with confidence. He had risen quickly within the Vikings, earning the reputation of a man who could be counted on when confrontation turned violent. His name carried weight, his presence carried fear, and his loyalty to the Brotherhood was unquestioned. But the very reputation that elevated him also made him a target. The Airlords had been watching. They knew his face, his movements, his routines. In the ongoing chess game between the two confraternities, Esosa's name became a piece that needed to be removed. He was no longer just another Viking. He had become a symbol of the fraternity's strength. And in a world where symbols mattered, taking him out would be both strategic and symbolic. The first signs of danger appeared as whispers within the Viking circle. Rumors circulated of Airlords lying in wait, of plots being devised in response to past confrontations. Every move Esosa made had to be measured. He could no longer wander freely, no longer trust the familiar routes across campus. His life became one of constant vigilance, moving in groups, scanning faces, and anticipating danger at every corner. But no matter how careful a man was, the cycle of violence had a way of catching up. For Esosa, The decisive moment arrived suddenly, without the warning that his paranoia had taught him to expect. It happened in the shadows, as so many of these encounters did. Esosa had been moving through an area of campus less crowded than the main walkways. Perhaps it was fatigue, perhaps overconfidence, or perhaps simply fate, but that day he was not surrounded by the full presence of his brothers. The Airlords had chosen their moment well. They came not as individuals but as a coordinated group, overwhelming him before he could react. The clash was brutal, fueled by years of rivalry and the weight of revenge. For Esosa, it was not a matter of courage. He had never lacked that, but of numbers and inevitability. Alone against many, even the strongest fall. The capture was swift, and once he was in their grasp, the outcome was sealed. On a campus where confrontations rarely ended with simple warnings, the fate of a Viking caught by the Airlords was never in question. They had not come merely to scare him, they had come to end him. His execution was as much a message as it was an act of revenge. Within confraternity culture, every action carried symbolism. By taking Esosa's life, the Airlords were striking not just at the young man himself, but at the fraternity he represented. His departure was meant to remind the Vikings that no one, no matter how feared, was untouchable. The news spread quickly. In universities like Uniben, word of such events traveled faster than official channels could ever contain. Students whispered in corridors, stories multiplied with each retelling, and fear settled over the campus like a heavy fog. The details varied. Some said he fought until the very end, others claimed the ambush was so sudden he never stood a chance, but the conclusion was the same: Isosa was gone. For the Vikings, his loss was more than personal. It was an attack on their pride, a challenge to their dominance, and a wound that demanded response. For the Airlords, it was a victory in a rivalry that showed no signs of ending. And for ordinary students, it was another grim reminder of the price of campus confraternity life, how quickly admiration, respect, and fear could dissolve into tragedy. Esosa's downfall was not just the story of one young man. It was the inevitable conclusion of a path that countless others before him had walked. He had entered the university seeking respect, craving recognition, and longing for the life he had once admired from afar. He had achieved all of it, but in the world of confraternities, every rise carried the seed of a fall. The boy who had once been invisible was now unforgettable, but only as a cautionary tale whispered in fear. When Esosa fell, the entire university shifted. His demise was not a quiet one, hidden in shadows. It was an event that spread like wildfire. Within hours, whispers became loud conversations, and conversations became fearful silences. Students spoke his name carefully, as though invoking it too freely might summon danger. In the Viking Brotherhood, his absence left a void that was felt immediately. He had not been their leader, but he had been one of their strongest, visible, loyal, and unshakable in his convictions. For younger members, Esosa had represented what it meant to be a Viking: fearless, respected, unbending. His departure shattered that image, reminding them all that even the boldest could be broken. For the Airlords, his execution was a victory, but even victories carried consequences. They had sent their message, but messages in the world of confraternities were rarely one-sided. The Vikings would not simply mourn and move on. They would watch, they would wait, and eventually they would strike back. The campus atmosphere darkened. Students who had no part in these wars now walked in fear, avoiding late lectures and deserted paths. Rumors of retaliation spread, each one adding another layer of anxiety. Uniben, a place meant for learning, felt more like a battlefield. Esosa's name became a symbol. Some spoke of him with respect, remembering his rise from obscurity to recognition. Others spoke of him with caution, using his fate as a warning against the allure of confraternity life. To the administration, his end was a crisis they could not ignore, though official statements often fell short of addressing the true depth of the violence. In hushed tones, Seniors told juniors the story of Esosa. They described how he had once been an ordinary student, unnoticed by most, until he embraced the Vikings. They told of his rapid rise, his confidence, and the fear his name inspired. And finally, they told of his ambush, the day the Airlords ended him to prove that no one was beyond their reach. His story was not told with celebration, but with gravity. It carried weight. It carried warning. And slowly, it became part of the unspoken curriculum of Uniben, a lesson about ambition, loyalty, violence, and the inescapable consequences of confraternity wars. For Esosa's family, the loss was personal and devastating. Far from the campus, they received the news that their son, who had gone to Uniben for education and a future, had been taken by the very culture he had embraced. To them, he was not a Viking, not a symbol, not a feared figure. He was a son, a brother, a life cut short. Their grief was deeper than the rivalry, untouched by the politics of cult life. And yet, for the university community, Esosa's end was not unique. He became one more name added to the long list of young men who had sought belonging in confraternities, only to find execution. His story echoed those before him, and would, tragically, echo again in the years to come. In the end, Esosa was remembered in many ways. To the Vikings, he was a fallen brother. To the Airlords, he was proof of their dominance. To ordinary students, he was a reminder of how dangerous campus life could become. And to history, he became another cautionary tale, another chapter in the endless cycle of violence that scarred Nigerian universities. Esosa's name did not fade quickly. It lingered, whispered in fear, recounted in warnings, etched in the memories of those who had witnessed the rise and fall of a young man who had once wanted only to be noticed. His end was not the end of the violence, nor the end of the rivalry, but it was the end of his journey, a journey that began with ambition and ended in chaos.